Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at resource allocation in economic systems, which corresponds to page 2 in your textbook. So, the goal for this video is to define how resource allocation is influenced by the economic system adopted by society. If you remember from the last video, we said that scarcity forces people and societies to make choices. You have to decide how to use those scarce resources, those resources that people cannot use simultaneously. And basically, what an economic system is kind of the answer to scarcity. It is the answer to the question, if we're living in a world in which we have to make choices on what do we do with our resources? What are we going to do? What goods and services are we going to make? Right? There's a collective decision making that goes on there. And the result of that is an economic system. When deciding how to use resources, societies have to answer three key questions. The first one is, what goods and services are we going to produce? We can't make everything. Scarcity is a thing. So, what goods and services are we going to produce? Are we going to do fruit? Are we going to do Diet Pepsi? Are we going to do pins? Are we going to do paper? By the way, these are all things as I'm recording. I'm looking around the room and trying to come up with examples. But what goods and services are we going to produce? Second, how are we going to make these things, right? If you think about a pen, a pencil, whatever, there's a lot of ways to make these things, right? A lot of companies have different ways of doing it. So, what's the most efficient way of doing that? And then finally, and here comes a vocab term, who is going to use or consume these goods and services? The word consume here, it means use. And yes, that could mean eat. I think that's what you probably associate the word consume with, but it also just means to use. So for example, if you're, writing with a pencil right now, you are consuming the pencil, you're using the pencil. So who will consume these goods and services, right? And how do we decide that? Is it going to be by lottery? Is it going to be by who can afford it? Is the government going to get involved? Like, the answers to these questions really determine the economic system. So let's go ahead and define economic system. It is a system for coordinating the production and consumption or use of goods and services, right? It is essentially the answer to scarcity. How is a society going to determine what to make, how to make it, and who gets those goods and services? That is an economic system. Now, this definition may seem familiar to you because an economic system is also called an economy, and we talked about that word in the last video when we talked about macroeconomics. And so, again, this is another example of synonyms. We saw that in the last video with resource and physical capital. That there's multiple ways of saying the same thing. So, an economic system is also called an economy. So, economic systems are characterized, therefore, by who gets to answer the key questions, right? That's how we differentiate them, okay? There's actually several kinds of economic systems out in the world, but there's two we're going to focus on in this video and in this course: market economies and command economies. And so, we're going to spend the rest of this video looking at each type of economic system. But before we do that, let's go ahead and do a practice question, the first of three in this video. So go ahead and read the question, pause the video, and then we'll go over the answer. So the correct answer here is going to be A, who consumes goods and services, right? So the government's decided that cheese sandwiches must only be eaten by 8-year-old children from this day forward, right? Pretty strict. But that's determining who is going to consume the goods and services. It's that third and final question. Once we've made the goods and services and we've determined how to do that, we have to decide who is going to answer, or who's going to, I should say, use those goods and services. So, with that in mind, let's turn to the first of two economic systems we're going to look at in this video, and that's market economies. So, a market economy, sometimes you'll hear it called a capitalist economy, is a system in which buyers and sellers coordinate the production and consumption of goods and services. So, buyers and sellers are determining what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it, right? So the way that works, and we'll talk a lot about this later on with supply and demand, is this idea that basically when you start a business, right, you're basing that business off of sorry, a customer's need or want, right? So customers like, man, I'm really thirsty. And so a company like Pepsi or Coca-Cola come along to meet that need, right? And that's determining the production and consumption because, if you go out to sell a product and no one buys it, well, guess what? It no longer gets made. And if you produce a product and people really like it, then it keeps getting made. And that's how a lot of economies around the world are coordinated. So, one very important part of market economies are property rights, and these are laws that establish ownership of property. And that's so important because, if you live in a country or a society where you're worried that your property could get stolen at any moment, it's really hard to be comfortable with starting a business or maybe even buying a home, which would then lead you to buying things to put into the home, right? This idea of property rights is really, really important, right? Because and I see my own students as I walk through the building. Sometimes students will just leave their backpacks and then somewhere, and they'll go walk off and go to the restroom, get a drink, whatever. And the reason they're comfortable doing that is because of property rights, right? That if someone goes along and steals their backpack or their phone or whatever, there are laws in place to protect that, right? So property rights are really, really important. Incentives are also really important in market economy. That's a reason to do something. Market economies are really good at giving buyers and sellers the reason, the incentive to interact, right? If you're a buyer, the incentive to interact with the seller is to purchase something that you need. And a seller's incentive for interacting with a buyer is because they're going to get money for whatever they're selling that they can use to enrich themselves and live a better life. And so incentives are super important in a market economy. And market economies do a great job of creating those incentives. And of course, property rights, as we talked about right here, help with that. And so, in a market economy, property rights and private or individual resource ownership incentivize production and consumption, as we just talked about, right? So, kind of just to summarize that point. So private ownership, it basically means that, the government's not owning your stuff, right? So like you own your computer, your phone, your AirPods, your coaster, whatever the case may be. And so, in a market economy, prices also are very, very important because they serve as an incentive for firms, sellers, or businesses. Remember, we talked about that word in the last video, to make products most valued by consumers or buyers, right? So, if you think about prices, right, maybe you go to the store and you're trying to buy, I don't know, paper towels, and you see two brands of paper towels, and you're like, well, they kind of do the same thing, but one's a lot cheaper than the other one. You might go with that cheaper brand, right? But sometimes, people like to buy the more expensive thing because they assume that means higher quality, right? So prices are sending signals to buyers and sellers, helping them understand what consumers want to buy, what sellers therefore should sell. And prices are just so important in playing that role in a market economy. And that's why most countries today, including the United States, have a market economy because it works really. It's not perfect, but it works really well at creating opportunities to start businesses, to participate in the economy as a consumer, etc. Right? It does a really, really great job of that. And so most countries in the world have a market economy as a result. And that's what that says there as well. So, practice three, let's talk about that. So, which the following is necessary for a market economy to function well, but is not necessary for a command economy to function well? So, go ahead and pause the video, and then we will go over the answer. So the correct answer here is going to be D, a well-defined and well-protected property rights. That's very important, right? We'll talk about command economies in a minute, but we did mention in the last video that property rights are important because they protect people's stuff and give them the comfort and the incentive to go out and contribute to the market economy. So let's go ahead and finish up the video by talking about command economies. So in a command economy, this is where the government takes command. It's a system in which the government or some other central authority coordinates the production and consumption of goods and services. So when you see command economy, I want you to think government. Government's in charge, government's making the decisions. In a command economy, there are no property rights, and because there's no private property, all resources are owned publicly or by the government. And so, command economies, I'm sure you've already guessed that they don't work too well. As I talked very positively about market economies, and the reason why is because it's really hard to combat human behavior. In command economies, they would work if you had a government that was very benevolent, very selfless, and was able to really know what people needed, right? Like if Martha needs a pencil, we get her a pencil. If Bob needs a house, we get him a house. But the problem is, in so many of the countries today that have command economies, and there's not that many of them to begin with, the selfishness creeps in where the people in power tend to hoard the resources for themselves and keep the general population impoverished. And they use different tools and tactics to try to keep it that way. And so while command economies may work in theory, they don't work very well in practice. And so, also in a command economy, prices play little to no role, right? Because there's no buying and selling really in command economies. It's really about what is the government going to give you, right? You don't need prices to tell people what to buy and sell because the government's really doing all that work for you. And you can see that that's pretty hard to do well. And so, a couple examples of command economies, you got North Korea and the former Soviet Union, 1917 to just the year after I was born in 1991, are examples. And I think you can tell that one of them no longer exists, and one of them is kind of a pariah in the modern world, that command economies just don't work because people's, you know, people tend to be selfish, right? And the nice thing about market economies is market economies work even though people can be selfish, right? That when this idea that Adam Smith, who was the kind of the father of economics, he talked about this idea of the invisible hand, that each person doing their own thing would be kind of guided almost by this invisible hand towards outcomes that would benefit everyone, right? When an entrepreneur starts a business, they're thinking about how to enrich themselves, but in doing so, they provide products that are great for the consumer, right? So market economies are great because in everyone thinking about themselves, we actually end up thinking about each other in the process from an economics point of view. Whereas in command economies, this selfishness kind of perpetuates the demise of the economy because it's so centered around a few people controlling everything, and that doesn't work very well. So the final practice question here is which of the following is not true of a pure command economy? So go ahead and pause the video, and then we'll go over the answer. So the correct answer here is going to be prices serve as signals to allocate resources. So the idea here is that, in a command economy, there's no need for prices because the government is really in charge of everything there. So that's all for this video on resource allocation and economic systems. Until next time, have a great day.